From the time you're born till the time you die, you're a consumer.
It's very important how many people are in the population and how they migrate.
Demographic changes influence GDP growth, inflation, yield curve, equity premia. Most people behaviorally don't reduce their consumption. In the G20 countries, women are better educated than men. In my lifetime, India is unable to catch up with China.
When everything is good, everyone is happy, everyone is friends. When things don't go so well, they start to blame their neighbor.
Demographics affects every country, every household, every economy. It is wrong to say demographics is predictable.
Hello and welcome to Capital Horizons, the podcast where money meets politics. I'm Igor Yelnik. Our guest today is Amlan Roy, founder of Global Macro Demographics. Amlan is also a partner at LCP and a research associate of London School of Economics Financial Market Group and Systemic Risk Center. Hello, Amlan. Very good to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be on your show, Igor, and thanks for inviting me. I look forward to your podcast and what questions you have in store for me.
So we're going to speak about demographics today. Most people believe that demographics is a very boring thing because nothing really happens on a daily basis because things are happening so slowly. But then all of a sudden, they take this center stage. So my first question to you is, what are the demographic trends which are happening now as we speak, which people ought to think about but don't?
So first of all, thank you very much, Igor, for inviting me. And I'd like to say that there's a big misconception regarding demographics. I've been researching it as a macro finance professor for the last 24 years. And I picked up on something that Peter Drucker, the biggest management guru, according to Harvard Business School, and also the biggest pensions guru, said in a book called Management Challenges for the 21st Century. He said demographics is the single most important factor that no one pays attention to. Yet when they do pay attention, they miss the point. I will argue that you and the rest of the world who talk similarly, saying that demographics is long term, it's very boring, it does not change, are quite and very humbly quite incorrect in your interpretation, because I go to the origin of the term demographics. I'm a researcher. Demos is people, graphos is characteristics. Nowhere in the definition of demographics is the word age or is the word number of people there. It's something which has been misconstrued, misconceived by people who looked at demographics. And so people characteristics mean that Igor and Amlan are two individuals. What are the most important characteristics of Igor and Amlan? From the time you're born till the time you die, you're a consumer. So am I. So is a baby born in Great Ormond Street Hospital, or the oldest lady in Okinawa, Japan, aged 114 years and 131 days. So we are all consumers from the time we are born till the time we die. And we are workers for a big lifespan, a part of our lifespan. As consumers, we consume 70% of the GDP. We affect inflation daily. We affect interest rates daily. In fact, today the Fed is looking at how the jobs, non-farm payrolls, and the job market work. And that has to do with your and my work characteristics. So it is wrong to say that demographics is long-term. It is wrong to say demographics is predictable. It is only so if you believe that the only thing characterizing Igor and Amlan is their age. And the second contradiction I'm going to give is me versus my wife. We both have 5 academic degrees. We are from India. She grew up in one city. I went to 13 different cities in 11 states and spoke 6 languages. I like to go and watch football, cricket, sports. She likes to go to the museum, to the opera, and sing. We are same age and we are very, very different despite coming from middle class India. So I also give the example that I gave to the Prime Minister of Japan and the cabinet, showing them that the 5 oldest countries in the world, I wrote a paper and we can send you the paper: Italy, Germany, Japan, Sweden, and Greece are very similar in age, but very dissimilar in consumption, in education, in health, in pensions, and behavior. Therefore, demographics is very much aligned to people characteristics and is aligned to behavior. It is not just saying that Igor 15 years later is going to be 15 years older, Amlan is going to be 15 years older. Are you going to consume iPhone 43 or Samsung Galaxy 39 or yet something else, no one knows, no one can predict. And therefore, demographics is not predictable. It has been wrongly misconstrued to be just age and population numbers. And if you look at consumers and workers, further to equity premia, yield spreads, real estate, commodities, and to government budgets. So demographics is not.
I'm sorry. May I interrupt you here? So you just said a very important thing, that demographics is actually having a direct effect on the financial markets, on equities, bonds, commodities, anything. What is this link exactly?
The link is that consumers affect GDP growth, workers affect GDP growth and inflation. GDP growth and inflation are used for the determination of the most important interest rate called R star. We've shown that demographic changes can influence GDP growth, inflation, yield curve, equity premia. And that is looking at age structure, looking at wealth of consumers, looking at also hours worked by workers, which affects their productivity growth, their participation rates. All these things go into a mix affecting the five fundamentals. Number one, it affects real GDP growth. Number two, it affects real GDP per capita growth, which is living standards. Number three, it affects inflation. Number four, it affects R star. Number five, it affects the yield curve. If it affects all these things, thereby it affects asset prices and asset allocation of pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies that I've been presenting to for last 10, 15 years, but now many more are taking it explicitly into consideration.
Excellent. So if we take the US into consideration, there is this significant immigration via the Mexico border. At the same time, we have seen the problem of aging population and baby boomers coming out of the working age and starting to consume. And this is not a new trend. It probably started about 15, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, some people, some scholars believed that when baby boomers retire, they will start selling their assets, and this may exert a downward pressure on equity prices. All these things do matter. So when you forecast the age, the education level of the population, when you can forecast migration from one country to another, usually from more poor country to a richer country, you can make some predictions about macroeconomics, which you mentioned, and also about asset prices. Is this correct?
Yes and no. You've covered the whole gamut of lots of things, starting with immigration. So I'm going to take you to something you ought to be familiar with given your educational background, and it's called the Demographic Manifesto, named after the Communist Manifesto. So it's been presented to the government of the country that you were born in, as well as 73 other countries, and 47 countries have changed retirement ages based on this document. It's a chart book written in 2000 with 16 pages, and the manifesto said countries are growing older as the old share of the population increases. The population pyramid, which used to be very few people at the top, it becomes flattened out, and because of that, there's something which is called the aging time bomb. So the Demographic Manifesto came up with four policies addressed to governments on how to tackle the time bomb. And the first one, and that's why it's very radical, it said abolish mandatory fixed retirement, first three words of the document. Replace it with flexible, enabled retirement, allowing people above 65 to work part time, part year, part week. First solution. Second solution, increase female labor force participation, because in most countries, even in the communist countries, once they became much more open, there's a gap between male and female labor force participation. In the G20 countries, women are better educated than men, yet they get paid about 11% lower for the same job, and the male female labor force participation gap is 9.8% just in the G10 countries. So enable and empower women. Third, selective immigration. And I've been very critical of the US and UK for taking in too many immigrants without asking the right questions. And we advocate selective immigration. which was done only by two countries in the last 20 years, and I give them a B. Rest of the countries I give a D. So US gets very upset and UK because they don't ask the right questions, which Australia and Canada did. How many immigrants do we need? Which skills? For how long? And Igor, just for your edification, the European Commission has a paper I did on 4 centuries of immigration. This was during the asylum seeker crisis. The first country whose population in the world is declining from 1973 is not Japan, is Germany. Without immigration, German population was decreasing, and immigration has contributed a lot to growth. And the fourth solution in the demographic manifesto, it was written in 2000, said do not bring in immigrants if you can't or you don't want to. Outsource jobs to poorer countries like India, Sri Lanka, Costa Rica, Peru, etc., so that when you're sleeping, they can do some of the heavy work. And a lot of these things have happened with in Japan and Singapore, two of the longest lived countries. People in Mitsubishi, in Sony, and in Toyota are coming back from retirement at age 69, 72, working 2 days a week, part time, part year, part week, getting insurance and engaging with the younger workers. And old and young give a big productivity boost. So these things are already happening not just in Japan, in Sweden, in Netherlands, and a bunch of other countries that we advise. So I'm very happy to tell you that this document, which is very non-technical, has had a lot of policy impact. And migration is very important because during the COVID crisis, when there was no migration, Bank of Canada and Reserve Bank of Australia wrote papers showing that their GDP growth rate went down by 0.6% to 0.75%. So immigration, as you said, is very important, but also important to know it is not numbers of immigrants. Again, I'm taking you away from numbers of people. It is to
It's
know
also
that the
it's
immigrants.
also which kind what kind of people you take. Yes, absolutely.
No,
And
skills, hours
yes,
worked, and their
yeah,
behavior. Immigrants tend to work much longer hours in every country that you go in, even with the same skills. And the unskilled people work longer, but even with the same skills, because they don't have the safety net, they are new and their behavior requires adaptation before they become meshed in along with the other citizens. And that
absolutely.
takes time.
But now let's consider a very interesting example, which is the European Union,
Hmm.
where the movement of people, the free movement of people, is one of the cornerstone principles.
Hmm.
And what we have seen is that people are migrating from the Eastern European countries, and have been migrating from Eastern European countries to richer West European countries such as Germany, France, Holland, Sweden, UK, when UK was part of the European Union. What do you think about this process? How did it affect the economies of richer countries and poorer countries, and how did it affect the asset prices in these countries?
I haven't looked at directly immigration and asset prices, but it flows to the real GDP growth and real GDP per capita growth route. So let me explain to you. During the last asylum seeker crisis, when people were coming from Syria, etc., there was a country which is the fastest decreasing population in the EU. And I went and gave a CFA Society talk for them. The country is called Liechtenstein. Okay. And both.
Not a very big country there.
Yeah, and Lithuania, both Liechtenstein and Lithuania, small countries, and they did not want immigrants. So that was one thing. Germany was taking in asylum seekers, France was, but these countries which are reducing their population, I said you could take in, and they said no, we are very homogeneous and we are happy the way we are in a small kind of a country. Then the second point that I showed is the average asylum seeker or immigrant, when they go into Germany, Germany takes roughly about 4 to 5 quarters to get them net productive of the costs of integration. In France, it takes roughly about 7 or 8 quarters, and in Italy, it takes 10 or 11 quarters. So, immigration is not a universal phenomenon in terms of an immigrant going into Germany and being net productive of the costs. It's much quicker by nearly a year compared to France and nearly a year and 3 quarters compared to Italy. Why? Because Germany has, since they've been doing it from 1970s, has a very well integrated program of getting in the immigrants integrated into the fold so that they behave closer to normal workers who are German
Hmm.
native workers or German native consumers. So a
Yes.
lot of demographics is all about behavior. So the first thing is immigration in Canada and in US last year's growth was attributed a lot to immigration. If you read the headlines of the CBO or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which are the US big agencies, they said the growth was driven by immigrants. But while the growth was driven by immigrants, GDP growth goes up. But GDP growth you divide by population growth, and what do you get? GDP per capita growth. And that is an even more important indicator than GDP growth. Let me explain why. Let's take two countries, India and China, the biggest countries. Let's assume they're growing at the same rate. India has always grown less than China. But India's population growth rate has been more than double, sometimes even three times that of China. So if the numerator is the same, GDP growth of two countries, but the population growth
Hmm.
of India is double, India's GDP per capita growth staggers relative to China. And I've
Yeah.
made statements in my own country, India, saying in my lifetime, India is unable to catch up with China, irrespective of what you think. And there's that divergence. So GDP per capita growth in my book I highlight is what? It's living standards growth, because after GDP per capita, if you take out taxes, what you get is disposable income, right?
Yes.
And taxes are different in different countries. Let's assume there are no taxes. Then GDP per capita is the best summary statistic of living standards. What do you do with GDP per capita? That's my average income. I can either consume it or I can save it. That GDP per capita growth in 73 countries is following GDP growth and going down. So if living standards go down, I have only two options. I can either reduce my consumption or I can reduce my savings. And most people behaviorally don't reduce their consumption. So what
Hmm.
goes down is savings. And I warned all financial institutions, and I've seen financial institutions from the largest hedge funds to the largest private banks in Credit Suisse across 43 countries in 1 year that I traveled, okay, in 1 year. And what did I tell them? I told them that you are likely to see, if savings goes down, financial institutions will get affected. Banks, asset managers, insurance companies, investment consultants. And that's what we are seeing, because GDP growth of the world is going down, both emerging markets and developed countries. And if population growth doesn't go down too much to offset it, then we will find GDP per capita going down. So your question was very good. And if savings goes down, that affects asset prices via the savings investment connection.
If we consider a political aspect of this, I'm thinking again about the European Union. Clearly, joining the European Union for Eastern European countries such as Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Baltic countries was a political act because they were too close to the former Soviet Union. So the European Union was another alternative. And then all of a sudden, they lost a significant part of their population to the richer European countries. And interestingly, it was the highest quality part of the population, on average, of course. Not everyone, but on average, it was a higher quality part of the population which migrated. If we follow your logic, with which I agree, then at least this aspect of joining the European Union was not so good for those countries.
You are absolutely right. And that's why I have gone into emerging markets countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, as well as the richest few countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, who are now complaining that they've taken in too many immigrants, as they did in the 80s and 90s. And I said, when you took in immigrants, every country henceforth and going forward, please read my papers and in my book, my advisory to labor governments and labor departments in lots of different countries is every country needs to do different on immigration. Number one, ask the question, how many immigrants do we need? With skills? For how long? What's the cost? What's the benefit? And do we need short term or long term? I'll give you an example. In Japan, the highest growth in wages today is for Filipino and Thai nurses who've been brought in to replace robots who were looking after the 80 plus year old population. The 80 plus year old population, and this is the fastest growing population group in the world, is the 80 plus. They
Mhm.
voted in Japan to say, we don't want robots to track us down. We need human beings. So in came Filipino and Thai nurses. They learnt 1,000 words and they were humans. They started speaking to the Japanese old people. Otherwise, Japanese old people were getting dementia, MS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. So, one big thing about aging is aging can be good if people are partially engaged. Aging can be bad if you're socially disengaged, and then the costs are very high. And therefore, the emphasis today in Japan, Norway, Sweden, as well as in places like Germany and Italy, is healthy old age living. And healthy living means lower costs on governments because governments would then otherwise spend a lot of money. But you are absolutely right. There was a lot of brain drain from I call them CE3 countries, Czech, Hungary, Poland. I used to cover them while I was an emerging market strategist, and I can show you. I made a joke once in Switzerland when they were hosting the European football championships. I said the good Polish players came and to Germany and they joined the German team, and the good German players came and joined the Swiss team. And in both cases, it was gain. The Germans came to Switzerland, increased their income. The Polish people came to Germany and increased their income too. So it's a theory of comparative advantage and where you get paid the most.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's think about the cultural part. When a country like Germany takes in asylum seekers from Syria, for example, it's importing people with a very, very different culture. Same happens
Yes.
in any other rich European country. You can say the same thing about Holland, UK, or whatever. Then we can see clashes of the local population with the immigrants. Sometimes they don't integrate very well with the society. When everything is
Sure.
good, everyone is happy, everyone is friends. And when things don't go so well, then they start to blame their neighbor, and their neighbor is different. So it's very easy to blame someone who is different.
Okay. Yeah. So I get your point, and you said exactly what I've so far said in 43 countries and blamed the Swedes and the Danes and the Norwegians for taking in too many immigrants. So it's like the weather is good, my income is good. I say, Igor, come over every weekend. We will watch football and have pizza together. Then all of a sudden, I lose my job. I say, Igor, please don't come to my house. I don't want to see you because I can't afford it. So that's what in a lot of rich countries, the
The
so-called
worst thing,
charitable.
sorry, Amlan. The worst thing is that you will tell me, Igor, I lost my job because of you.
No, no, you're too clever. How may I lose your? You will never cause anyone to lose their job. You can only give productive, good advice. But let me, aside from the triviality and the nice humor, the Swedes do agree that I showed them that there was a big spike, and they never asked the question, what kind of skills. They were being overly charitable, and the Swedes and the Danes and the Norwegians didn't have the same kind of practices of integrating immigrants as France and Germany, which had been doing for 40 or 45 years. They didn't have that same kind of program. Now, let me introduce you to somebody who predicted 9/11, who is far smarter than anyone you've had at your podcast, and Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, as well as Fukuyama call him the guru of international affairs. And he predicted 9/11. He's no longer alive. He was the best professor of international relations at Harvard, and he wrote this book which showed what's happening in your country, Russia, what's happening in India, what's happening in China, and he showed Ukraine versus and Crimea versus Russia. His name is and the name of the book is Clash of Civilizations. Professor Sam Huntington, and he shows what's happening in the Arab world, the Muslim youth bulge, India versus Pakistan, Crimea versus Russia, and his second book. And he shows that there will be a clash whenever there are migrants coming in and you don't integrate properly. And he said even in US it's going to cause a problem. His second book, where he challenges US identity, is called Who Are We? where he shows that people in Sacramento are different than people in San Diego or LA because they came from different parts of Latin America. You mentioned Mexico. So, some people came from Colombia, some people came from Mexico, some people came from Chile, and even across them there are differences because they tend to stay together. But the most important point you've made, Igor, which is a real point, and I thank you for making it, is whether it is the Middle East, where you can see poor people from Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh going to work, or whether they go to New York and then they become the biggest taxi drivers out there. They tend to try to live in a ghetto, more or less. Even in New York, there's in Queens and in Chicago and other places, the Indians tend to live. And if you do live like that, sometimes you don't assimilate or integrate that well.
Hmm.
Whereas in France and Germany, the social department has always tried to spread people around rather than have the Turkish people and the Algerian people and the Moroccan people all in one place. So that initially that they started, that does help assimilate a bit better. And if you don't do that, then when you go to even a place like Dubai, they say, "Oh, that's little India, that's little Italy, that's little." In New York, they can tell you, and similarly, this happens in
Hmm.
other places
Yeah,
too.
sure.
But Sam Huntington is the guru of what is happening in the world, and he wrote it in the 80s. And that's why Kissinger called him the guru of all gurus on international relations. And so did Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose parents came from the same kind of place that you do, and it's the same place that Andrei Schleifer and all came
Yeah. Okay. Since we speak about Middle East quite a lot, there is one country which is always in the center of big geopolitical events in the Middle East, which is Israel. There is a bigger demographic problem in Israel if we speak about this country, in my opinion, because Israel was created as a Jewish state. And nevertheless, the Arab population in Israel is very significant. Arabs in Israel have the same rights as Jews, and they are able to vote. There is an Arab party represented in Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and the Arab population is growing faster than the Jewish population. I didn't make any calculations. I don't know the forecasts. But if it goes this way, that at some point, the Arab population, it's possible that it will exceed in numbers the Jewish population. What do you think about this?
So I'm going to skirt that and use my privilege not to talk about geopolitics, but I will give you a parallel example that I knew a little bit about coming from India. And India is a huge country. And in India, many of us feel that it's the second largest Muslim country in the world. It has more Muslims than the whole Arab world after Indonesia. And there's a lot of tension because of certain kind of states that they are more populous in and bordering Bangladesh. In Calcutta and West Bengal, there's a lot of legal and illegal migration going on. So the Indian government is quite concerned about what's going on in Bangladesh as well as what's going on in Nepal because people come through those borders, and lots of times, because India does not have very, very good boundaries like walls or kind of barricades to prevent infiltration, there is similar kind of a problem even in India of integrating people of different faiths and different religions and different languages. Although India itself has 28 languages and 300 dialects, but people coming from, let's say, Bhutan or Sikkim, or even coming from Nepal or Sri Lanka, etc., sometimes that's creating problems, and that's a big issue that the Indian government is having to deal with. But even in Israel, just going back just as an agnostic, I don't know much. If the population growth rate of one group is becomes higher, then they will have higher voting rights if that's a democracy. And we are seeing currently in India, there was a national promulgation where the president's rule was in Kashmir, and now they're having elections, and the whole world is watching because it's a point of tension between Pakistan and India. And
Mhm.
one part of Kashmir wants to be part of Pakistan, one part wants to be part of India. But I'm just giving it as a parallel example that with population growth rates being higher, immigrants tend to have higher population growth rates. In France, the population growth rates were higher, so French people didn't want to have the immigrants overtake them. So what did the French government do? They gave incentives. France has one of the highest fertility rates in the whole of the European Union. They gave incentives to French women to have the third child. They were not doing it out of generosity. So if you had the third child, you got 500 euros extra for the third child. Okay, this is, I'm talking
Mhm.
2001, 2002. Okay, and it continues. Why did they do it? Because as men and women in particularly women in more advanced countries get educated and enter the workforce later, they start having babies later. If you start having babies later, then part of the procreation reproductive cycle, some of them find they can only have one child. So the break even fertility rate is 2.1 children per woman. If some
Mhm.
French women have only one and some have three, then the average comes close to two, and you don't need to bring in so many immigrants. That was part of also some of the native logic, because again, charity begins at home, and everyone wants to preserve their own culture and civilizations. There are very few countries which are as open as the US in taking in people from everywhere. I would say even UK is very liberal in terms of taking in and giving benefits to lots of other countries.
Yeah. Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
Sometimes, and usually it happens because of large wars, like the World War II
Hmm.
or the current war in Ukraine. There are significant demographic sort of gaps. The fertility falls, people get killed during the war, many people immigrate, millions probably of people have immigrated from Ukraine now, and probably not all of them are going to come back. The implications of such fertility gaps or demographic gaps, I don't know how you
Oh
call them
yeah,
professionally,
absolutely. Again,
they will be felt for generations. How to deal with
absolutely.
them?
Absolutely. So if you looked at, and I could, again, it's there in my book, but people do know, Japan suffered a lot because of World War II. And you can see Japan and also in places like Russia and Germany, post war reconstruction meant that their fertility rates were down and took some time when people normalized for fertility rates to go up. So, what people call as the baby boom generation. The baby boom in US is very different than in Europe in terms of dates, magnitudes, etc., and is also very different than Japan. I show that in my book, but everyone seems to think just because it's happened in US, it's happened in other places too. So after World War II, there was a MacArthur era rebuilding scheme. So Japan took a long time to rebuild, and only after a certain period did their fertility rates go up. And at one point, their fertility rates were higher than US. And then again, in Japanese families, they started having fewer children because cost of raising a child in many of these countries was very, very high. I've looked at the reason why fertility rates in the poorest countries in the world, the poorest two countries are called Niger and Malawi, where the median age is 15.2 years, or Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, Niger, and Malawi, fertility rates are going down. They're going down in UK, in Sweden, in France, in Germany, etc. And the commonality out there is not to do with income or wealth. The commonality has to do with three factors. Number one, it's the cost of childbearing. Number two, in places like Niger and Malawi, average male dies holding a Kalashnikov. At the age of 9 or 10, they learn how to use a Kalashnikov rather than solve math problems from the books like Krezik that you may have studied from, as I did, or Timoshenko. So they don't get to reach the stage of learning calculus following Timoshenko or Krezik. What they do is they are shooting. So there's a deficit of males relative to females in those kind of countries. So already then you find fertility rates are going down there. They're going down also in places like Afghanistan, where there's war on, and you talked about war. So during war, fertility rates again kind of suffer lots of times because of deaths, because of non normal conditions. Now, look at the rich countries. Why are women having fewer children, even in the Catholic countries like Mexico, Costa Rica, or Brazil? And the answer to that is, and I've done surveys in those countries, number one, the cost of raising a child is much higher. Number two, when a woman in the 50s or 60s in rural Brazil or rural India or rural China had a child, then out of three, one used to survive. Now, if they have a child, medicine allows nearly all of them, or infant mortality has gone down so much that they survive. So, if you're not in rural Brazil or rural Mexico or rural Japan, rural China or India, you don't need so many people. You need fewer children. So people in thanks to urbanization, and this explains a very important concept used by everyone called the demographic dividend. The Southeast Asian countries had a real big miracle based on demographics. They are called the Koreas, the Malaysias, the Singapores, etc. They in the 80s and 90s they urbanized, had fewer children, and also taught the remaining children very well. So, very productive children led to high GDP growth, and fewer people in the population, low population growth. As a result of that, GDP per capita went up. And the effect of demographics via fewer children, better education, urbanization, this is called the demographic dividend. And most people relate it to GDP growth, but it's not related to GDP growth, it's related to GDP per capita growth, which is living standards. And that's likely to happen when you have fewer children. But there's a negative effect also of this urbanization, and that is both in your the country where you were born and the country where I was born. The mega cities in emerging markets are now 17 out of the top 25 cities in the world, and they suffer from noise pollution, water pollution, crime, and the worst kind of air quality. So, the top three worst air quality cities in the world are the city I grew up in, and is number one, New Delhi, number two is Mumbai, number three in Calcutta. So, an average child born in New Delhi relative to an average child in Tokyo with exactly the same characteristics will live just at birth today 12.3 years lower. Okay,
Yeah.
that's the effect
Uh,
of air quality. And mega cities like Lagos, like Sao Paulo, like Rio de Janeiro, all of them, and Mexico City and Tokyo, they are creating agglomerations which create a lot of diseconomies and externalities of crime, congestion, etc., etc.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to the topic which we have tangentially covered. And I would like you to say a few words on this now. So, these significant demographic differences in different countries across the world probably require that pension systems should also be different. They should take into account the local demographics, not necessarily they should blindly copy what people do in other countries. Do you agree?
Brilliant, brilliant observation. I'm going to give you a finance answer where I advise Brazil and Mexico not to follow the Chilean example. But before that, I will give you something where you should go and give yourself a pat, saying that somebody who is considered one of the best central bankers in the past, when he read my paper, said, Amlan, all you're saying is that European Union has cultural differences, therefore their fiscal sustainability should be different. And I said, and his name was Mr. Trichet. He ran the European Central Bank. So I
He
wrote a
used to, yes.
paper, and I'm one of the first to write the paper. I said Greece will go bankrupt in 2004 in European Commission, and it's on videotape at CFA Society and European Commission, based on the fact that Greece made pension promises roughly three times more than UK and France. And where would they pay it from? So I got called Mr. Unsustainable Promises. So I've written a paper on fiscal sustainability showing that the richest countries in the world, the Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Norway, don't have enough money to pay for longer term pensions beyond next 15 years. So the paper I wrote is fiscal sustainability, it's not just the immediate term, but the medium and long term which matters. That was my 2010 paper, showing that European Union aging is going on at different rates. Again, immigrants, migrants, and in places, if you went to Latvia and Lithuania, the life expectancy is lower, the funding is lower, again in the CE3 compared to Netherlands, etc. And that can also be explained by lower education rates, lower hospitals per person, lower nurses per person, and also in general diets. So, if I said if that be the case and life expectancy is different and pensions are different, so the pension replacement rate is very different in Latvia or in Estonia compared to Germany and France. What the European Union, if they get 100 euros in taxes, 79% are spent on pensions, healthcare, long term care. So it's the old people who are grabbing a lot of the money. And the old people are also very rich. So my recommendation has been that for people who are in their 50s or just about 60, to tell people in the baby boom generation like me that please prepare for us not to give you those kind of benefits because we can't afford it. So the biggest mistake in corporate governance was made by people in defined benefit pension plans promising away things, yet no one has answered the following question, which is a question I've asked now at more than 1200 conferences. I've stopped asking. And the question is the following. Michael comes and tells me, Amlan, you're 65, you retire. Igor says, Amlan, I think you'll die when you're 85. Simple question. For 20 years, how much money do I need for post retirement? And I've asked 17 Nobel laureates, no answer. Okay, no one can answer it. Don't even try, because no one can tell you for 20 years what is inflation. Not even Bernanke Greenspan. No one can tell you for 20 years equity premium or bonds. No one can tell you also what will be healthcare costs in Moscow or New Delhi or Tokyo or New York or London of a 70-year-old woman who's going to live till 90, okay, or 65 till 85. And lastly, am I going to retire in a small village in India, or am I going to retire in Boston, one of my favorite cities, or London, or will I retire in a suburb of Chicago? Because I showed the state of Illinois pension scheme that if I have $300,000 and I'm retiring in Chicago, then that money for an average person will last 17 years. But if I went to Springfield, Illinois, just slightly further away, then that same money will last me 24 years. So we can't answer some of these questions, and we need to plan, break the 20 years into smaller bits which we can recalibrate and then revise our estimations. And it is very, very important to understand that we need to cut down these promises, otherwise there won't be funds for the younger generations. And I believe that baby boom generation and older are richer because they had four golden dividends. And the four golden dividends they have was they were working in the 80s and 90s when equities went up, bonds went up, real estate went up, and GDP per capita growth went up. And that's unlikely to happen for any other generation. So the current generations are likely for the first time to be having lower living standards than what the baby boom generation and as me did by improving on the parent generation. The current generations are not going to improve.
Yeah, indeed. There is one thing which I can tell about your 2004 bankruptcy forecast for Greece. It was very poorly timed because in 2004 Greece won the euro. So probably people were very optimistic there. Nobody wanted to listen to you.
No one wanted to listen even anyways, Igor, because when I asked the finance minister, and this is something you have to bear in mind, he said, Amlan, we first need to get re-elected. So
Of course.
politics trumps economics. So in why don't we have in other countries inflation is being fought because old people don't want inflation. And James Bullard of St. Louis Fed, as well as I, have said in countries which are aging, old people are voting to not have inflation, and old people vote a lot more than young people. And therefore, the voting power of the grey power is keeping inflation lower, whereas young people would like more inflation, and that would take down the benefits of the old people. And I didn't answer your brilliant question that there's going to be a stock market meltdown in 2011. So, first thing in 2001, there are a bunch of us, Robin Brooks, Milton Friedman, and us, we questioned the people from very good people from equities, Jeremy Siegel and all, who said stocks for the long run and therefore sell all your stock, move into treasury bill. So I said, how do you know big generation will sell all their stocks, the baby boomers, to a small generation? What prices will they get? Second, how do you know you've saved up enough that you really want to move from equities to bonds? And thirdly, Jeremy Siegel and all said, "Oh, we will sell the equities to the Indians and the Chinese." I said, "How do you know they'll have the income to buy also?" So ultimately, this debate was won by Robin Brooks, Zvi Bordi, Milton Friedman, and me, who raised those kind of questions relative to people who said there'll be a big stock market meltdown.
Yeah. All right. Amlan, I've got the feeling that we have just, scratched the surface. There is so much more to discuss about this. It's an endless topic. Thank you very much for joining me today.
But can I interrupt by saying that I want to leave 3 messages. Demographics is not long-term only. It has immediate, short-term, long-term impact. Demographics is not about age only. Age is a factor, but education, gender, migrant status, family, all those things matter too. And the third thing is demographics affects every country, every household, every economy and company on the balance sheet income statement level. Because if you're my client, you bring in revenues. I'm a cost. Revenues minus cost for every company or every country affect the income statement balance sheet. So
Indeed.
Think consumers and workers. And that's the way I like to think of demographics.
Thanks for listening. This has been Capital Horizons.
So if you'd like to see or learn more about Capital Horizons, please subscribe below.
From Michael and I. See you next time.